Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning, this special Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. Today, we have been studying from John's Gospel, and we left off at chapter 15. Today, because this is Easter Sunday, we jump forward to chapter 20, and then next week we will return to chapter 15, 16 for continuation of our studies from John's Gospel. Today's lesson is an interesting lesson. It's taken from chapter 20 of John's Gospel, verses 1 through 18. This is the discovery of the empty tomb. It is a special lesson. But it's also, or at least in my mind, the thought came upon me that it's a difficult lesson. Why is it a difficult lesson? It's a difficult lesson because everybody knows or should know the discovery of the empty tomb. So how do I present anything different than you have already heard probably many times? I enjoy information. I understand, though, that we also need to discuss and present application. From an information standpoint, today's lesson contains, I want to say, many mysteries, many questions that don't necessarily have an answer, but it is interesting to look at those questions and study them and get a better or a greater understanding of all that surrounds the story of the discovery of the empty tomb. But even though there are many questions, and we're going to look at many of them as we study this great, most important lesson, I'm reminded that the greatest question, the greatest mystery is answered with today's lesson. Did Jesus actually rise from the grave? Is the resurrection true? We're going to answer that question today. This lesson answers that question. Is that question important? What does it mean? Well, it is important. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and some of the verses between verse 14 and verse 19, he writes this: "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are to be pitied more than any man or any men." So it is an important question. It is the basis of our hope in Jesus. But before we can understand the impact of the resurrection on the disciples, we ought to examine their emotional state to understand how they respond to the news and react to it. So what is their emotional state? Well, Jesus has been tortured, crucified, and now endured the agony of the cross. This after one day, less than 24 hours after he sits at the Passover celebration dinner, what we call the Lord's Supper, and has been teaching them and telling them he was about to leave. A shock to their system. He even promised them another comforter will be sent by God. But now they have endured, they have witnessed Jesus enduring the torture, the crucifixion, the agony of the cross itself. And he has two thieves who are crucified on either side of him, and their death was hastened by their legs being broken while they're on the cross on either side of Jesus. Pardon me. But the Roman soldiers did not break the legs of Jesus. A soldier does pierce his side with the tip of a spear, and water and blood flow out. Again, his apostles, his disciples witnessing this. Finally, it is finished, and he is in fact dead. They take him off of the cross, the Roman soldiers, and give the body to someone who has agreed to bury it. Probably we can imagine his mother she is there at the cross. She embraces him for one last time, and the body is carried off to a nearby tomb, a burial place. Some of the women who have followed Jesus are helping Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus in preparing the body for burial. They fold spices, sweet-smelling spices, myrrh, and other aloes into the grave wrappings. And some of the other gospel accounts indicate that his body is wrapped in strips of cloth and in layers of strips of cloth as a part of the burial process. One of the questions that we might ask about, and we will get to that in a moment, is the Shroud of Turin. Is it real? Is it Jesus? We'll get to that in just a moment. After doing it in a rush, because the Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday night and essentially concludes at sundown on Saturday night or Saturday evening. They rush to get the body prepared, and then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and perhaps other men strain to roll the covering, the large heavy stone in front of the opening to the tomb. And so the women leave with heavy hearts. The disciples go to a place that they have apparently or probably used before, and they lock the doors behind them. They are deeply depressed. All of their hope is gone, and it's being replaced by fear. They lock the doors because they think the Romans or even the Jewish leaders who have brought about Jesus' death may be coming after them. So are they thinking about the resurrection? No, they are not. They have seen their friend, their teacher, the Lord, die a horrible death. It's over. The dream of a new kingdom, a glorious kingdom, is gone, and in their minds, probably gone forever. They walk as men without hope, without nothing to look forward to. But early the next morning, before sunrise, Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene, and according to other accounts, some other women who were followers of Jesus, they go to the tomb to complete the burial process. And so let's read and begin studying our passage for today. I'm reading from the New International Version for those of you who read along. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the opening, from the entrance. All right, who is Mary Magdalene? This is not Mary, the sister of Martha. This is not the Mary who anointed Jesus' feet with her tears at the home of Simon the leper, as we discussed in one of our earlier lessons, which is Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha. This is a woman who Jesus has healed of demonic possession. 7 demons he cast out of her. And she began and continued to follow him with other women, and has been a support system as well, thus indicating she may be a person of some wealth. Now, she finds that the stone has been removed from the entrance. Let's pause for a second. Why? Here's one of those questions. Why was the stone removed when she gets there, or that has been removed? Jesus did not need the stone rolled back in order to leave the tomb. But it is an important piece of evidence to show that his body was not in the tomb. That she can see. We're going to see Peter and John see, and thus provide eyewitness testimony, if you will, that the body is not in the tomb. He is not there. He has arisen. It says early on the first day of the week. That's Sunday, and that has now become the Lord's Day. And that is the day we worship the Lord, that we set aside each week to gather and worship him. It is truly Resurrection Day. The Jews worshipped on the Sabbath, which was Saturday, which is the last day of the week. It's funny, we think Monday is the first day of the week and Sunday the last. But no, it is as we just said. Sunday is the first day of the week. Verse 2, so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. She ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple. Most everyone believes that is John, the author of the book, the Gospel of John. And John writes, the gospel account says, she went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Now, why? Here's one of those questions. Why would John say the one whom Jesus loved? It seems almost arrogant of him to suggest that he is loved perhaps more than others, so much so that it would be a part of who he is known as. There are many speculations. They're almost all speculations. One is that John, who does not mention himself as the author of the book, nowhere in there does he refer to himself as John the author. He may be trying to hide his identity. One of the commentaries I read discounted that as a possibility because John was very bold. John was there the night before when Jesus was taken to the high priest's house, and Peter is going to be there denying Jesus 3 times at the fake trial, if you will. John was there, and already there before Peter came in. John even had a knowledge of someone and got Peter in. He's not hiding who he is. So while I've always heard that was the reason he referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved, that may not fit. It doesn't fit either that he is arrogant. But William Barclay, a great biblical scholar, he died in 1978. He opines that there are 2 Johns, and he tells of some of his research that finds that a suggestion that John the Apostle, John the disciple, is in Ephesus near the end of his life, and surrounded by other believers and followers who might still be alive. They are asking John to write his account. Now, William Barclay says that the Gospel of John was written around 100 A.D. I had heard and have read and always believed it was written around 70 or 80, maybe even as late as 90 A.D. But think of this. John was born after Jesus. It's believed he was younger than Jesus. So he's born around the early part of the counting system that we call A.D. So if he's 100 years old, or thereabouts, if the gospel is written in 100 A.D., 70 or 80 or 90 if it's written at one of these other year markers. And Barclay says there is in that church at Ephesus, and he lays out his research, another man named John, who is called John the Elder. And Barclay opines that John the Elder is the one who actually writes out the gospel as John the disciple is relating everything to him. And John the apostle, the disciple, is relating not only what Jesus said, but also things that also what Jesus meant. Barclay says, look at the letters at the end of the New Testament, 2nd John and 3rd John. And they both began the elder to, and it tells who the letter is written to, but it's from the elder. And so Barclay says, this is the same pen that writes, that physically writes out the gospel, that person is the same one who penned these letters. He is the scribe, if you will, for John the disciple. And so he's referring to himself as the elder in those letters. Here, he is just distinguishing when he says the other apostle, John. It's not me who's writing this down. I'm writing it down for the disciple that Jesus loved. So he is referring to John that way, not John himself. I pitch that out to you because none of us know the answer and cannot understand really why John the Apostle names or calls himself the one Jesus loved. Jesus loved all of the apostles. Let's go forward. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. This is after, and I think I read it in verse 2. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Notice she said, "We don't know." That's confirmation of the passages in the other synoptic gospels that say other women were with her there to help finish the process of preparing the body for long-term burial. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. There's been some speculation. Here's another question. Why did John point out that he outran Peter? Speculation, I think it's more than speculation, that John is younger than Peter, and he just outruns the older man. I don't think they're either one terribly old. I don't remember where the commentary came, which commentary it was, but one suggested another reason to believe John is not being arrogant and calling himself the one whom the disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. He points out that Peter is the first one into the tomb, but he is still competitive enough to say, "But I outran him." I don't know. I think that's a little bit humorous, and yet not terribly important. Verses 6 and 7, or 5, 6 and 7, he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. This he is John. He gets there. He bent over. He had to get down low to look into the tomb. One commentary says, in all likelihood, the entrance is only 3 feet tall, 3 feet high. So he has to get down. They have to get down and look in. But once inside, it's a large cavern, large enough that people could actually sit and view the body. There are tables, so to speak, or ledges on the side of the cave where bodies being entombed would be placed there in the tomb. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded by itself, separate from the linen. So John tells us Peter just rushes straight on into the tomb. I don't think he just kept running full bore. He had to stoop down himself to get in. But he goes on in. This is descriptive of Peter, who is the bold one in many of the discussions we have in the Bible about the 12 disciples. He saw the strips of linen lying there. Now here we are, the strips again, thus suggesting that the Shroud of Turin, which is a piece of cloth the length of a body that has the impression and face of a male who would have been about the same age as Jesus, but with a beard and longer hair, and there's an impression in the shroud. It has been suggested for centuries that this was perhaps the burial shroud covering Jesus. The problem with that is, let me pause and say, it's authentic, so most studies say. How the impression, it's not a painting, it's not a drawing, it is an impression of a man's body, and especially the face, from about the 1st century in time. But strips of linen is different than a shroud, one large, long piece of cloth. Peter saw the strips of cloth lying there, as well as the burial cloth. Some translations say the handkerchief that had been around Jesus' head. Why was there a handkerchief or a piece of cloth around Jesus' head? Well, one commentary said it is to secure the jaw to the head so that the jaw doesn't sag or appear to drop open. That's why it was there. But it is separate and apart from the strips of linen which are still lying there. All of this seems to suggest that the body of the Lord just came through the cloth, much as Jesus may have walked through the locked door later that night when he encounters the disciples where they were in the room where they were locked in for safety. He just went through the walls or the door, and thus he may have just gone through the cloth itself. The cloth was still there as if the body had gone through it. Not as if somebody had torn it off, not as if Jesus himself had pulled it away from him and taking the handkerchief or the head cloth off and set it aside. It's as if the body just went through these items of cloth. Verse 8. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, John still says, I can run faster than Peter, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. Now, what did he believe? Did he believe that Jesus had in fact been resurrected, that he was arisen, that he was no longer dead? That's what many, especially those who admired John, and most admired John, believe. But the next verse seems to say that's not right. The next verse says, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. One passage says, or one commentary says, they believed that he had arisen, but they didn't base that upon scriptures. They just based it upon the fact that he was gone out of the tomb and the linens are laying there. I don't accept that based upon verse 9 that we just read, and based upon the fact that they still did not believe. When the other gospel accounts, I think it's Luke chapter 24, Mary and the other women come and tell them that they have seen Jesus. And the rest of the passage, which I'm not going to get us to, it looks like, they see Jesus and they come and tell the disciples, and the disciples did not believe them, still did not believe them. Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, is given a derisive nickname, Doubting Thomas, because he said, I won't believe unless I see the nail prints in his hands. The other apostles said the same thing. But anyway, that's why I don't think John was believing the resurrection at this point. So what is it that he believed? He saw and he believed. The thing that makes the most sense to me is he believed now that what Mary had told him was true, that somebody had taken the body. The body is not there. Then we go on, and I'm going to have to rush to get through this because I have taken so much time in going over this. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. The apostle Peter and John see what's there, see the evidence that says that Mary had told them the truth, and they go back to the house where the others are to secure themselves in there. And they just go right past Mary, who's standing there crying. Verse 11, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. Just like the Ark of the Covenant, a cherubim at each end. One sits where his feet would be, the other where his head would be. And Mary sees these two angels. But she doesn't respond. She must not have, some suggestion is she didn't realize these were in fact angels. Usually when people encountered angels, they were in fear, such that the angels had to tell them, do not fear. Mary is just there and sees them and is crying. They asked her, verse 13, woman, why are you crying? Her response, still not a fearful response, but a I want to know. Her response is, they have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they have put him. Verse 14, at this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. Why did she turn around? Some suggest she might have heard a sound behind her. Another explanation that I find credible is she sees these two men dressed in white, which we now know and she later determined were angels. They may have looked past her. And so as you have been in the presence of someone who seemed to look behind you, she turns to see. I think she's still stooped down, and so when she turns, she may not have fully seen who it was that is behind her. Others say because of her tears and her emotional state, she's just not able to actually recognize who it is behind her. She did not realize that it was Jesus. Verse 15, woman, he said, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? Why did Jesus address her in that fashion? It's not out of character at this time to address a woman as woman. It is not a derisive term. It is let me ask you a question. And he asks her, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for? Verse 15, continuing, she says, thinking he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. Here's a question. How is Mary going to get this mature adult male with perhaps in her mind, all of the 100 pounds of spices that have been placed around his body in layers? How is she going to carry him? But she says, tell me and I will get him. That brings up another point real quickly. Those spices would dry and cause the strips of clothing to become hard. Another reason why it is remarkable that the strips of clothing are still right there in order. They're not torn apart, as would have to be the case in all likelihood if somebody was taking the body. Verse 16, a tremendous verse. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned toward him. So that means she really wasn't fully looking at this gardener to know that it wasn't a gardener, it was Jesus. She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, Rabboni, which means teacher, says John. I read several commentaries that says it is an endearing term, my teacher, my rabbi. Jesus says, do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers, and tell them, I am returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Verse 18, Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord, and she told them that he had said these things to her. She is telling them he is alive. He has risen. But there are all kinds of questions here. Why did he tell her, do not cling to me, for I have yet ascended to the Father? Because he is going to appear to others, and he doesn't tell them to cling to him. The suggestion may be, and I made some notes and see if I can pull them up, because I think they're great. They're Ray Stedham's notes, and my note machine won't allow me to move it. Why does he not permit Mary to cling to him? He is saying to her, Mary, there's a new relationship between us now. I'm no longer going to continue with you in a close physical relationship. Touching you gives you comfort, but it will no longer be that way. Just as he says, I'm going to ascend to the Father. Just as he told the apostles, there's going to be someone else. Your relationship is going to be greater. You have more access. Ray Stedham, another great theologian, says, I believe this is the first and the chief good news of Easter. Most of us celebrate Easter as a reminder that there is hope, that on the day when we have to leave this earth, we have hope. That Easter means because he lives, we will live as well. And certainly that's a major part of the message of the resurrection. But here the apostles and Mary are excited, not because they have hope of a resurrection themselves, but because their Lord is with them. He has not been taken away. He has not left them. All of us have that same celebration. Jesus is with us. He is alive. He is alive. And I've run us out of time. Do you know Jesus? You too can have the hope of eternity because he arose. You too can have him with you because he is alive. Thank you for joining us. Good morning.